Hi there, everyone. This is Lily Birdsong. Welcome to Queer Stories, where we talk about everything from movies to television, video games, novels, and sometimes even current events. So today I want to talk to you about J.K. Rowling's new book. This is actually not published under the name J.K. Rowling. She's published it under her pseudonym, Robert Galbraith, where she has this detective crime series. The book is called Troubled Blood, and basically it tells the story of a serial killer who dresses up in women's clothing to lure the women in before killing them. I'd like to start today by talking about some of J.K. Rowling's views as she has expressed them herself. Over the past year, there have been a number of controversies around her views on sex and gender. She is very much of the mind that women who are born biologically female are inherently different than trans women. And so she doesn't like it when we are all trying to campaign for a world in which both types of women or all types of women are recognized as women. She expresses particular hate around certain things that I would consider inane, such as when we try to use inclusive language like people who have periods, so that we can also include trans men in terms of the physical needs of people who menstruate. She mocked this idea by saying, instead of saying people who menstruate, why don't we just say women? That's what they're called. But the reality is that that is not inclusive enough to tell the whole story. She came into particular controversy last year when she had some tweets where she was supporting somebody called Maya Forstater. And this person had a contract that was of a limited duration at her workplace. And then her contract was subsequently not renewed after she had expressed some transphobic views in the workplace, which is completely within the rights of the employer not to extend a contract, by the way, for any particular reason that they might not want to. But what was really interesting about this was it did go to court. Maya Forstater took her employer to court, and the courts sided with the employer, saying that we need to protect the human dignity of people, and that her views were incompatible with human dignity. So when J.K. Rowling expressed support with Maya Forstater, it created a very big ripple effect, because a lot of people were concerned about that and thought that it might mean that she's transphobic. So in June of this year, J.K. Rowling actually released an essay in which she further expanded upon her views so that she could, in her own words, express what she thought. I'm putting a link to this essay in the description, and I do recommend that you read it and make your own judgments. In my mind, the essay is kind of trying to be both a victim and trying to say things that are hurtful to other people. She paints herself as a victim because she says not only about her previous experiences where she was a victim of abuse, but also she paints herself as a victim of people that are criticizing her views online. But when you post your views online, you're opening those views to criticism. Unfortunately, she was also the recipient of some abuse online, such as, people using swear words to describe her, which might have been going a bit too far. When you want to express that you disagree with somebody, whether you're doing it online or whether you're doing it in person, the best way to do that is not to call them names. The best way to do that is to, discuss the opinions that she's expressing, and then discuss why it is that your opinions are different, and then, try to learn from each other. So in her essay, J.K. Rowling is really talking about her desire to protect biological women and protect the spaces that we have as biological women, to protect children. And also she references the fact that some people who thought they were trans and went through transition, whether through hormones or surgery, some kind of everlasting change, then decided later on that they wanted to detransition. And I don't want to minimize those stories. They do happen. You can, search them out online and look at them. But the proportion of those stories happening is a lot less. And the way to tackle those particular issues is by creating more robust systems for us to have available for transgender youth, or for youth who think they are transgender, so that they can get adequate counseling. And that's already built into a lot of the systems and laws in the countries that we're talking about, which is, for example, in the UK, where she's from, in Canada, where I'm from, and in the US. You cannot go through any kind of medical procedure, including starting hormones, until you have at least a year of living in the gender of your choice first, as well as a number of other precautions that they're putting in place. So how does this relate to the book that she's written? I want to pull out a few specific quotes from her essay, and then we will discuss in general how transgender people have been portrayed in the media, such as films, over the past number of years, and why I think her new book is problematic. So first of all, here's some quotes from J.K. Rowling's essay. She said, "As many women have said before me, woman is not a costume. Woman is not an idea in a man's head. Woman is not a pink brain, a liking for Jimmy Choos, or any of the other sexist ideas now somehow touted as progressive. Moreover, the inclusive language that calls female people menstruators and people with vulvas strikes many women as dehumanizing and demeaning. I understand why trans activists consider this language to be appropriate and kind, but for those of us who have had degrading slurs spat at us by violent men, it's not neutral, it's hostile and alienating." Here's another quote. "If you could come inside my head and understand what I feel when I read about a trans woman dying at the hands of a violent man, you'd find solidarity and kinship. I believe the majority of trans-identified people not only pose zero threat to others, but are vulnerable for all of the reasons I've outlined. Trans people need and deserve protection. Like women, they're most likely to be killed by sexual partners. So I want trans women to be safe. At the same time, I do not want to make natal girls and women less safe. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, and as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth." She also said, "But endlessly unpleasant as its constant targeting of me has been, I refuse to bow down to a movement that I believe is doing demonstrable harm in seeking to erode woman as a political and biological class and offering cover to predators like few before it." So I'm not going to go through this entire essay. I'm going to say a few things about it, but I highly, highly recommend that you check out a link that I'm putting in the description, which is a video by my favorite trans YouTuber, Jamie Dodger. And he goes through his reaction to reading J.K. Rowling's essay. But there are a few points that I just wanted to pull out from this essay that are specifically relevant to the book. She talks in this essay about her concern about female spaces like bathrooms and changing rooms. She references about how the fact that gender confirmation certificates are given out before you take surgery or hormones means that any man can declare himself a woman and then have access to these spaces. The reality is that we want for those certificates to be given out before people take hormones. This is specifically a way that they handle this issue in the UK. But we want to see the same behavior in North America and in other places in the world. Because what we want trans people to be able to do is to live as their chosen gender for a while before they do anything surgical, before they do any hormones, so that they can make sure that the life that they're going to move towards is the life that they want. The last thing that anybody wants is for somebody to do something that they cannot reverse in their body and then discover later on that they weren't actually experiencing gender dysphoria in the first place. So she's almost contradicting herself, because earlier on in the essay she talks about how she's really concerned about transgender youth having access to hormones too early. And yet in the same breath, she's saying she doesn't agree with certificates that will allow people access to spaces before having hormones. So it kind of doesn't make sense. It's like, what are you saying? Do you agree with one or do you agree with the other? And the reality is, when we look at transgender people, and I'm lucky enough that I have several amazing transgender friends, if you ask them to go into the bathroom of their original sex, they would become a target in that bathroom because they don't look like that sex anymore. So for them to do that, you're asking them to put themselves at risk, which doesn't make any sense. Of course, the ideal is that we have gender neutral spaces. So we have bathrooms that are individual stalls, and we have changing rooms that are individual changing rooms. And I think women would like this as well as anyone else, that we would have the ability to go into a space where we can be by ourselves and do those things that need to be done in private. But that doesn't mean that I'm so fearful of my safety as a woman in a changing room that I want to prevent somebody trans from having access to that changing room. That doesn't make any sense to me. So this whole bathroom debate has been a big one, particularly in the US over the past number of years. And so we now have some statistics that we can look at, and those statistics show that there is no increase in any kind of assault or violence against women in bathrooms because of allowing transgender people access to those spaces. It just doesn't happen. The other thing statistically that we need to look at is what is the violence that's happening against transgender people. And the thing that I'm really scared about, and that I think a lot of trans supporters and trans people are scared of, is that the numbers of violence against trans people is actually going up. So if we compare the numbers in 2020 to 2019, just in the United States, since those are the numbers that I have available to me today, then we can see that already in 2020, 28 transgender people have been murdered. And that is already higher than the number of people that were murdered in 2019. So the trend is murder rates against transgender people are going up. So you might wonder why that is. We view ourselves as a progressive society that's becoming more inclusive over time. But the reality is, at the same time, these messages are being spread that are saying transgender people are violent, transgender people, you should be afraid of them. And when people don't know anyone transgender, and then they encounter somebody transgender, and you have a fear response to that, then you can reach out and lash out with violence. What we see is that violence is statistically perpetrated the most against transgender women. Out of those 28 murder victims in 2020, 23 of those were transgender women, 4 of them were trans men, and 1 was non-binary. What we see is that the violence is the highest amongst African American and Latina trans women. So I'll just say a quote for you from Rodrigo Hang-Lehtinen, who is the Deputy Executive Director for the National Center for Transgender Equality. He said, "Transgender people, and particularly Black and Latina transgender women, are marginalized, stigmatized, and criminalized in our country. They face violence every day, and they fear turning to the police for help." So when we look at these statistics and we see the huge amount of violence against transgender women, how is it helpful right now to perpetrate the stereotype that trans women are somehow men dressing up in women's clothes? That's not helpful. That's not the message that we need to see in 2020. So let's talk about the book. Troubled Blood tells the story of a serial killer who dresses up in women's clothing to lure them in and then murders them. J.K. Rowling defended her use of this trope, let's say, because it's loosely based on the stories of real people. One serial killer that she referenced was called Jerry Brudos. And Brudos killed 4 women in Oregon in the 1960s. He apparently stole women's underwear from neighbors, defiled that underwear, and then when he abducted his victim, Karen Sprinker, he was described as a large man dressed in women's clothing. The other serial killer she referenced was Russell Williams. Williams was a former commander of Canada's largest Air Force base. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 sexual assaults, and 82 counts of breaking and entering to take items of underwear from women and young girls. So there are cases where this kind of thing happens in real life. But does that mean because something happens in real life that somebody like J.K. Rowling, with the platform that she has to write about this, and has to write about it in the same year when she is making it so difficult for the trans people who love her books to continue to support her? The amount of violence against transgender people is so high already. We should not do anything to make them further targets. And what does it do if not make them a target when we claim that transgender women are simply men wearing a costume? And these views are exactly what she said in her essay. A woman is not a costume, she said in her essay. And so clearly that is her view of transgender women. I'd like to encourage you to watch a new documentary that's out on Netflix called Disclosure. And this documentary invites trans actors and actresses to discuss their experiences. I thought the story of one of them was so interesting because she told this story about how when she first came out to her coworker, the coworker said to her, "Oh, like Buffalo Bill, the serial killer in Silence of the Lambs." And this coworker didn't mean it to be an attack or something mean. That was simply their only frame of reference. They had never met a transgender person before, and they'd seen this movie with somebody that was claiming to be transgender, and they were a serial killer. So that was their frame of reference for what being transgender meant. So if you've never met somebody trans in real life, how do you get your information on what it means to be trans? You're going to get it through what you see in the media. What do you see in newspapers and television and movies? And when we look at the history of transgender portrayals in cinema over the past 100 years, we will see a lot of depictions of transgender people as murderers. Or maybe not even transgender people. Maybe it is similar to this case where it's a man that's using a costume to go out and kill somebody, and they're putting on this female costume. But this is not something that we need more of. I'll just list a few movies for you to get an idea of just how many there are. We have the movie Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. Norman Bates was a character who ended up dressing in his mother's clothing when he attempted to kill the girl. We have Freebie and the Bean, which depicts a man in woman's clothing enacting violence in a bathroom, of all things. We have Dressed to Kill, which has a man dressing up in women's clothing to kill a woman. Sleepaway Camp is a slasher film where a young girl commits murders. And then we find out at the end of the story that this young girl was actually a young boy who was adopted by an aunt who didn't want a son, and she'd only ever wanted a daughter, and so she raised this kid as a girl. One of the most famous, of course, is Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill, like I just mentioned to you. In this case, this character was actually a transgender person, or at least thought he was, and he was denied access to surgery for whatever reason. And so he decided to become a serial killer and literally take the body parts of females to make a bodysuit. So he is that perfect literal embodiment of the idea of a woman being a costume. We have Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation, where we have a cross-dressing character wielding a chainsaw. And we have Insidious Chapter 2, cross-dressing character dresses up to commit murder. These are just the ones that I found after a quick search, and I can guarantee you there's going to be others. So if this is how you're learning about trans people, it's no wonder that you see them as a man in a dress, and it's no wonder that you see them as a threat, because that's how they're depicted on film. What I loved about the movie Disclosure is that it's giving you a glimpse into the eyes of real trans people who are trying to break the barriers of the previous stereotypes that we saw in the past. So these amazingly brave, beautiful trans people are saying that they would like for you to see them on screen as they are. And they argue that when you see a cisgender person acting as a transgender person on the screen in a role, that it perpetuates this idea that you're really cisgender on the inside. And so what we need is to see more trans people writing their own stories and sharing those stories through the media of television and film. If you learned about trans people by watching amazing actresses like Laverne Cox, Angelica Ross, Jamie Clayton, and Jen Richards, just as some quick examples, I think it would be more strange if you looked at those people and thought of them as men than if you look at them and see them as what they are, which is women. So in conclusion, I'm going to say something that I've never, ever said and hope that I don't say again, which is don't buy the book. Don't give this woman your money. We don't need more stories like this. We have enough. We need more trans-normative, trans-positive stories. So don't buy the book. Even out of morbid curiosity, don't buy it. Don't give her the satisfaction of taking your money. In fact, if you want to buy a book right now, I'm going to put a link in the description to a list of books that are written by trans authors. And I'd recommend that you go and read one of those. It would be a much better spend of your time. So thanks very much. I hope you learned something by watching this video. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content like this, then subscribe. If you want to support me in being able to continue creating content like this, support me on Patreon. Thanks so much and have a great day. And we're testing the microphone and everything else. And there's a cat. Look at this cat. Hey. What are you doing? Say hi, baby. Hi, baby. What are you doing? Are you being good today? Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. Oh, yes. This is a baby. This is a baby.